Welcome back to Virginia Free with Dr. Bob Hollsworth, brought to you by What's Next Virginia. Thanks, Brian Sullivan, back in the studio. Bob, this week we're going to be talking about COVID, Northam's numbers, the Veep stakes, and what's going on with this special session. Let's try to take these in order because I know people are still very, very concerned about the COVID and where we stand in Virginia, but we also have a specific question from a former delegate in Charlottesville, David Toscano. So where are things now a week later in Virginia with COVID?
I think what we're seeing is we're seeing some case rise in Virginia. The last 2 days we had 1,300 cases and then a little over, I think, 1,100 cases today. So we had been at 800 or 900. We had been as low as 500 to 600. So now we're seeing the cases almost double from where they had been a month ago. And that's a little concerning. Deborah Birx, the White House chief of the coronavirus task force, has said this weekend that we're entering a new phase. And what she meant by that was that it's not only in the metro areas, it's in the rural areas. And that's true in Virginia. It's outside the major metros. It's in other metros now. We see Roanoke City. It's in some of the suburban areas in central West Virginia. We're seeing it in Bedford and Lynchburg right now. So it's kind of progressed. Now, Northern Virginia, which had been leading the case rise, I've seen a little tick upward, but it's still about 200 to 250, between 200 and 300 cases a day. And Hampton Roads has more cases right now than Northern Virginia. So by and large, I think the governor is going to have to take a look at these numbers as they go on, because if these cases continue to rise, I think you may see an effort to cut down on gatherings, not only in Hampton Roads, which he limited to 50 from 250, but you may see that limited across the state if we continue to see this case rise.
Yeah, I think one of the, just in conversations with the people across the state, and one in particular, State Senator Bill Carrico, who is considering to run for governor, he's at 18 in his church. And I asked him, I said, well, what are y'all doing at your church? He said, look, we're wearing masks, we're socially distant, we just don't know how it got here. We really don't know. They've lost 3 people. Many of the cases are asymptomatic in most situations, but still the social impact is now being felt at a very proximate level for the people in the rural areas. Yeah,
I mean, Washington County, for example, went from about 60 cases to 180 cases this month. A lot of the folks in Southwest think it may have to do with where people are vacationing, actually. Mm-hmm. They think a lot of people have gone down to Myrtle Beach. That seems to be very popular in Southwest Virginia. And they think some people may be carrying it back from South Carolina to Virginia. But whatever the case is, that we've now seen it in Washington County, Galax, go down south side to Danville, Pennsylvania, and you begin to see the spread. These numbers aren't huge in these communities, but they're impacting the communities. And I think they're, the real problem, besides the people who have it and the destruction that can cause, is the anxiety this is giving to school reopenings. Right. In a lot of these places about what should we do now that we actually see the virus in our community.
How is that impacting college reopenings?
Well, it's impacted in some ways and not in others, Chris. What we've seen is that the majority of public universities in Hampton Roads have delayed college reopening, delayed the students coming back. They may be taking classes virtually for 2 to 3 weeks. We've seen that with William and Mary. We've seen that with ODU, for example. So most of the schools in the Hampton Roads area are reacting to the rise there. VCU actually will be bringing people back next week. The students will come back to Richmond, and that's going to put another thing into the mix in a region that we really don't quite have a great handle on exactly what's happening. Richmond's been relatively steady the whole time. When Hampton Roads was very low, Richmond was between Hampton Roads and Norfolk. But Richmond's getting in between 100 and 200 cases a day in the whole RVA communities. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, what happens when VCU comes back into that mix and you bring a 30,000 person community into Richmond? Is that going to have an impact on the numbers or not? And so that'll be something that everybody's going to be watching. for the rest of August for sure, Chris.
Are they going to be doing some level of 2-week quarantining on campus? Like, you know, you really can't go off campus or out of your classrooms? Are they going to do virtual, or is that some of the plans that the colleges have? Is to say, look, you're coming back on campus, we're going to go virtual for the first couple of weeks, sort of an NBA, NHL bubble.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge of making the colleges a bubble. Dorms are not. Colleges are built to be social networking institutions, not social distancing institutions. Right. And so that is going to be the challenge for all the universities. The second challenge will arise, as you said, about this whole issue of online and in-person classes. If you sign up for 5 classes and you come to the university, whatever university that might be, VCU is not the only one for sure in this case, and you find out that 80% of your classes are online, are you going to be comfortable with that? Or are you going to want to ask for a tuition discount? So I think we're going to see some student activism at a number of several Virginia universities around this whole issue of costs, depending on how many online classes they're actually taking. For example, I do know at VCU, I think that any class over 50 will be online, which means that tends to be many of the classes that first-year students take.
Right. Well, that's going to be, that leads us into the conversation about K through 12 reopenings and everyone basically going virtual or some level of a hybrid plan. And that's always going to be tenuous because you have this inequity between kids with broadband internet and computers and those who don't. But where does that play out next year in planning for high school? I mean in college, in the K through 12, because you have an election season coming up, and obviously one of the political parties is going to make hay on this, and I would imagine it's going to be the minority party, the Republicans. Well,
Chris, I think what's going to happen is that we don't exactly know at the moment where is this going to proceed. What we've seen so far is, I think, among the parents, there's kind of a mixed feeling. A lot of them would like to come back and have their kids in school. There's some who are worried about that and they don't want to do that. But at the same time, we've seen increasing number of school systems, particularly the larger systems. This is not true of all the smaller systems, but the larger systems are starting off virtual. And we have to see how far that goes and how long it lasts. And one of the questions that is going to emerge is exactly as you said, what's going to happen to the education system as this virus sort of moves forward or moves back? We don't really know. But one could imagine that you could get into the flu season where people wouldn't be able to distinguish at first whether they have the flu or whether they have the virus. And that would complicate education even longer. I think the key issue that the Republicans are likely to make hay on, if they can, is that there really hasn't been extraordinarily explicit guidance from the state to the localities about when it's right to reopen, when it's not to reopen, when you should go to the hybrid case. There's not kind of a protocol here that everybody's doing this in sort of a patchwork way. And in some instances, that really makes sense because the situation in one part of Virginia could be very different than the situation in the other part of Virginia. But I think, at least from my perspective, you would want more explicit guidance about here are the conditions under which hybrid makes sense. Here are the conditions under which in-person makes sense. Here are the conditions under which fully virtual makes sense. But I think what you're seeing now is that many of the superintendents, many of the teachers, they don't want to be the early adopters, you might say, of fully in-person. They want to wait and see how this plays out in a number of other places before they make their decision. But I think what you put your finger on is that there are a lot of uncertainties that are likely to really move into the political arena in such a way that's going to be central in the next election cycle.
I think it's going to be absolutely central because we're going to have a complete paradigm shift in K through 12, which is the dominant spending portion of local budgets, and state budget as significant education, especially K through 12. But it's also the dynamic socially. A lot of parents are like, well, I want to get my kid back to school, but a lot of them are probably saying, I want my kids out of my house.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the other issue is that it's related to the economy, right. About, how are you going to care for your child? if the child is home and you're trying to get back to work, and if you're in a situation where you're an essential worker and actually have to, can't work at home, you have this whole question of what happens to virtual education. How successful is it? Sort of the experience in the spring certainly wasn't that encouraging. There's obviously a lot of kids who are going to do just fine in it, but there are a lot of teachers and a lot of kids who are at the moment uncomfortable with that. And there's a real concern that there's going to be a social inequity compared to the people, excuse me for a second here.
All right.
For the people in particular who come from either lower income families, or there are still places in Virginia, Chris, where broadband is not widely available. And those kids really have to suffer by comparison, I think. So my sense is that the issues emerging in education at every level are likely to become far more political. And what we've seen so far, I think, is that the governor, who's had a relatively cautious approach to reopening, who's been relatively successful in how the public views him on this, has taken sort of what I call a moderately hands-off attitude about providing the kind of guidance both to colleges and to K-12 that might give us some kind of statewide directive about what should be done when.
So is that the unknown that has led to his drop in the approval ratings recently? We mentioned a poll before we go on live here.
Yeah, the VCU did a poll last week in which his COVID approval rating, I'm not sure it was his general approval rating, went from 76% approval to 61%. Now that's not terrible by any means, and it's actually probably pretty good. But I think what happened is that early on in the United States, we saw people not very happy with the president's response, but they seemed to be far more happier with their governor's response. So that it was like sort of a rally around the governor's effect. And that's diminishing a little bit now as the pandemic just soldiers on, seemingly inevitably. And then secondly, there's all kinds of questions being raised. I think there's just so much uncertainty right now with respect to these school reopenings that it's hard to say that we absolutely have a wonderful handle on the situation. There's a lot of anxiety about it. No one quite knows what's going to happen, and we'll have to see how it plays out. But right now, I think there's growing uncertainty in August, or July and August, about what's happening when these kids at any level go back to school.
Yeah, we've sort of baked into our psyche this notion that you have to have, when September rolls around, the kids have to be back in school. A delay is something not outside the ordinary anymore. But the question comes in from former delegate David Toscano about examples of other states in the country where COVID response involving more than just executive branch and planning out these elements to the response. What are you seeing around the country that Virginians can draw comparisons to?
Well, in some instances, you have the governor simply mandating that schools are going to open on a certain date in a particular way. And you have the school superintendents engaged in some form of passive resistance typically in that, particularly in some of these larger areas. Right. I'm not sure that's the best model either. I'm not sure the mandate model is. I think the model that seems to be the best model is if you can have a state that works with its public health authorities and maybe the CDC as well, to set out this direct guidance about here's where you should be hybrid, here's where you should be fully virtual, here's where you should be fully in person. And I think those kind of systems where we don't have too many of them, I think we see a little bit of that in the Northeast states right now, actually. But those seem to me to be the best models. One where it's not simply gubernatorial mandate, but one where it's not simply, let's just leave it up to every locality to decide what they're going to do. And you wind up having school systems in the same region with vastly different responses to how students are going to be educated. I think we need to find some balance between central guidance and local control.
Because what you see in some of the more suburban counties is you have pockets of density and then very rural portions with very rural schools, and they have a very different reality inside their own locality. Do you see any localities that are doing it better than others in Virginia? And so far
Well,
as
I think right now they're all playing it by, playing it by ear. And, typically what we've seen is that in July, early July, most folks were thinking that they were either going to be hybrid or fully in person. And then as July went on and we saw these cases rise, we saw this tremendous shift among superintendents and teachers, and for a variety of reasons, concerned about safety, perhaps concerned about liability. And more of the larger systems moved to fully virtual with sort of a hybrid option. Sometimes they're bringing in English as a second language students. Sometimes they're bringing in special ed students. I saw a superintendent from Tennessee yesterday that had a hybrid system where they brought students in for at least, I think, 1 day a week. 20% of the students came in, and then 80% of the students were virtual, but they at least had 1 day a week in which they could talk to the students, work with the students, and get them prepared for the online. And that may be a kind of hybrid model that we'll see in Virginia. But again, what I'd like to see is more discussion, more dialogue, and more sort of public presentation of these models to give the local school boards and the superintendents a little more guidance than they have right now, because I think they're all, the school boards are just kind of doing the best they can in a situation of uncertainty without very good explicit guidance. And you have to understand that in some of these communities, the public health infrastructure is so small that they can't provide that kind of guidance that you could get from the Virginia Department of Health, or you could get from the governor's office.
What are you seeing around the state, and Virginia in particular? Well, maybe not Virginia, but insofar as the national political polarization impacting gubernatorial decisions and local government decisions, because of we're in this very heightened 2020 election season, is the political polarization impacting decision making?
I think not so much, actually, in terms of the K-12 education. I don't think it's exactly where folks are going. I think by and large, what's impacting it more are the discussions between where do parents want to go, what do teachers want to do, and then beyond that, what might be the liability issues that school systems would face as well. So the superintendents and the school board would be quite concerned with that. I think what you're going to find is that the issues of safety are one that the teachers have really been raising, and then the parents have. In many of these initial polls, you saw a plurality to sometimes majority of parents wanting to have in person, particularly for like K through 6. So I think that's what's happening right now. I don't see that polarization impacting each and every locality in terms of how they're proceeding, but I do think it's going to have an impact on politics going forward, because now we're going to have this issue of what do you think about schooling? How should it happen? And how should it happen in a way that we're going to make sure that our students are both safe and they don't fall a year and a half behind? I mean, because the last thing you want to do is to emerge from this COVID with a lost generation of students who are a year and a half behind, sort of the people who came before them or the people who come after them.
Well, and you mentioned it, I think you touched on it, not intentionally, but you talked about all the needs of certain kids. You have the ESL kids, you have the special ed kids, and then you also have these, very advanced kids with, very supportive family structures. And I think you're going to see a paradigm shift in the way we deliver K through 12 that's going to completely upend the K through 12 structure in this country, because parents are going to go, you know what, my kid doesn't have to go 5 days a week. Right. They're perfectly good staying at home, and I can go year round if I want to. And the school systems are going to have to adjust to this reality. And the politicians are going to go, you know what? Full flexibility is what my people want. They demand that in their daily lives and every other service they get. Why can't we do it in K through 12? Because obviously, when push came to shove, we made changes.
Yeah, I think it just depends on how well that works. I mean, the challenge is that let's say Fairfax County, where you would think would be the county that would certainly be leading in quality online education. And they had a tremendous problem in the spring with the response of the parents to what was happening. And part of that may simply have been that they didn't have the opportunity to plan. But you know, the fact was is this was brand new for them. There are some, you know, private companies that actually do this. I think they do it pretty well. But by and large, if you were a public system and weren't doing it, and all of a sudden had to do it, you know, immediately, even in a system that's as high quality as Fairfax and that serves certainly a multiplicity of students, but also a lot of high-end students, they had challenges as well. So we're going to have to see whether the K-12 system is actually up for the challenge of performing well in terms of the virtual education. And the big fear on this, Chris, is really how is this going to impact, you know, students in, you know, in areas of rural Virginia where they don't have broadband, or areas in urban Virginia where a lot of kids don't, you know, are getting Chromebooks or something for the first time and haven't had that kind of computer literacy. How's that's going to happen? And I would tell you something else, that even in the higher ed system, at VCU, we served, I was on the board there until July 1, we serve a lot of first generation college students, a lot of Pell eligible college students. And when we surveyed them over the summer about what they thought of the, you know, of what happened when they, all the classes went virtual, we saw among that group of students a greater concern about not having the in-class opportunity. So we're going to have to see how this works out, both for everyone and then for specialized populations, whether it be English as a second language student or first generation college students and the like.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about Virginia politics is we have an election every year of some consequence. We're going to test this out real soon in Virginia, especially coming up in 2 weeks' time when the Virginia General Assembly meets again in special session, and add the dynamic of former Speaker of the House, Kirk Cox, announcing he's considering a run for governor, which means he's basically running for governor. As you know, he was a 30-year veteran of the school system as a teacher, and there's a vibrancy to the education issue. What do you see coming up in the special session related to COVID and education?
Well, you know, at the moment right now, the special session is starting off with, you know, issues of the budget to see where the budget is going to go. And I think there's going to be something that's going to be related to education there. What's going to happen with the schools? And again, that's another issue that, you know, is yet to be fully addressed. If the schools are going to reopen safely, how are they going to do it? And then, you know, I'd like to see a little more imagination go into this. I mean, are there, you know, vacant buildings that could be rented, that are vacant rooms that we could have? You know, are there some places that in the fall we could have outside classes if we went in there? I mean, there are a variety of things that, you know, one might think about doing that could potentially be possible if we were, you know, sufficiently creative and imaginative there. But I think, you know, the other issue is making sure that the schools have the PPE, that they have the, you know, the money to buy the plexiglass dividers, that they have the things that they're going to need if they function at all this year. So I think there's going to be some sense of money in terms of providing schools with the resources they might need to do that, which I think have not yet really been fully there. Then secondly, clearly the social and racial justice movement is going to be an important part of this session, largely because we've seen the Legislative Black Caucus come up with a pretty extensive group of reforms on criminal justice that I'd like to see as well there. So we're going to see a set of issues there. So then finally, we've seen the Republicans come forward with some plan to try to limit the governor's emergency powers to 45 days before bringing back the General Assembly in session. So the open question for me, there are two open questions here for me, Chris, is one, are we going to see some more direct discussion of education given that we're going to be right at the beginning, at the cusp of when this school year is starting. And is anybody going to be bringing forward any ideas here? And then secondly, to go back to the politics side, what are we going to say about the upcoming elections? You know, right now we have, we've passed this no excuses absentee ballot, but Virginia is not one of the states that is going to send an absentee ballot to every voter. Is there any Democrat who is going to propose doing that as far as legislation? And at least at the moment, you know, that's not on the legislative information systems, you know, bill pre-filing. So I think those two issues are going to emerge as well. They should emerge, education, and then I think what's going to happen with this next election, largely because this is going to be, you know, uncharted territory, given how many absentee ballots we're likely to have, what's going to happen with the post office, and whether or not we're going to wind up with in-person voting. If we, you know, you could imagine that by November, we not only have COVID, but we have flu season going as well. And that could really change things pretty dramatically.
And delayed election returns. The interesting point about the part about the upcoming General Assembly special session, is that you have this potential massive budget crunch coming with declining revenues, which were better than expected, but with a new wish list of spending that the Legislative Black Caucus has come up with. Senator Bill Carrico estimates $500 million a year at the top end. Then you have the extra needs of K through 12. Then with the federal government's funding to the state, we just saw in the paper today, the hospitals and insurance companies fighting over money in Medicaid programs. So this has a potential to get really sideways for the Democrats early and get them off message and narrative in Virginia, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on, you know, two things there. First, how bad is the crunch? You know, certainly the initial estimates of last year, you know, the fiscal year we just ended, turned out not to be anywhere near as bad as they were. But then the question is, it's also related to the federal government. What type of support are states and schools going to get out of the next federal package? And who knows whether that'll be settled by the time these folks come back. So that could be an area as well. And then finally, you're going to have some jockeying back and forth, I guess, on the Democratic side, as people who are considering statewide runs certainly are going to want to put down some markers themselves about issues that they think are there. So, you know, for example, I think you're going to see this whole issue of paid sick leave come back from the Democratic side as well, because there are a number of folks like Jennifer Carroll Foy, considering, you know, who's running for governor, who thinks that this is a good issue for her and wants to put this back on the table, particularly because of what's happened in the COVID situation. So, you know, typically these special sessions are pretty constrained, you know, that they're focused on one issue or a single set of issues. This one is likely to be a little longer, and then B, to be a little broader in terms of the issues that get raised. And I think we're only have begun to see some of them, and we may begin to see some more as this arises. And finally, I might add, you know, inside the Democratic Party, there is not uniformity between the House and the Senate as well on how to approach most matters, and that could become a factor as well.
Do you see this becoming a Pandora's box for the Democrats?
Well, not necessarily, because I just wonder whether the Republicans can ever come through sort of in a unified way to take advantage of the problems that the Democrats have. The Democrats have been really riding extraordinarily high in Virginia. So long as Donald Trump is the president, that's likely to continue. But at the same time, we're beginning to see, I think, the fissures that do exist inside the Democratic Party. They're going to emerge sort of more broadly and more visibly than we've seen to date. And certainly they will emerge in a, next year as we have, a whole host of people running for statewide office on the Democratic side. And I think that's probably what Kirk Cox thinks he might be able to take advantage of. And that, but his first challenge, of course, is getting a nomination.
Right.
Inside a party where people who supported Medicaid expansion haven't done too well.
Right, and then we'll find out how impactful that is when the state central committee of the Republican Party determines its nomination method, which is just in, I think, 12 days time or 11 days time. So Virginia is always fun this way, isn't it? It's just
remarkable.
it's extraordinary. I think this special session has a real chance of getting away from the Democrats, and if it does, I think they'll shut it down and say we'll come back in January. Let's jump, if we can, to the Veep stakes, since Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden, is now set a date of August the 10th to announce his selection for vice president for his ticket of the Democratic Party, which is Monday, this upcoming Monday. Where do you see this thing right now?
Well, I think the vice president decided that he really needed to go forward with this because we've had this sort of very public jockeying back and forth and surrogates of various candidates criticizing other candidates, and that's not exactly what Joe Biden wants. My sense is that it's coming down to 3 individuals at the moment. Maybe I'll turn out to be totally wrong. Kamala Harris, Karen Bass, and Susan Rice seem to me to be the top 3 contenders. Rice, of course, with a foreign policy background. Kamala Harris, very, very, very well-known senator. Karen Bass, head of the Congressional Black Caucus, had been chair of the speaker in the California General Assembly. Seems to me that one of those 3 folks are going to be Biden's choice. And by and large, Harris, I think, is the best known, because of that, may have some liabilities. Karen Bass seems to have really moved up very, very strongly in the in the Veep stakes as time's gone on, and it does seem that Biden himself has some affection for Susan Rice as well, who is less versed in the political arena than the other 2 individuals. So if you were just handicapping that, you would say that might be a longer shot choice. Because if I'm Joe Biden, what I don't want is really a mistake right now.
You can't have a mistake, and I think we've often seen the undercard, if you will, can't be the overcard. The vice presidential pick can't be, able to overtake the nominee, and I think that's why Susan Rice and Kamala Harris are probably not going to be picked. I think as someone who is competent, like Karen Baskin can be sold as being competent, and I think her recent attempts to knock down the whole Fidel Castro connection there or support was important to winning Florida. So we'll see how that registered in their weekend polling to see if that did that has any damage in Florida. I'm sure they're polling the heck out of that thing. So that's my pick. I'm thinking Karen Bass because she's less known and less likely to take the spotlight off of Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think that Harris still may be the safest choice for him, but we'll have to see. So I think a couple of weeks ago, I think I said I thought it was Harris and Bass, and I still think those are the 2 favorites, even though there's obviously a lot of affection for Susan Rice and a lot of people who think she'd be very good. But I tend to think that if you've not been in the electoral arena, it's really tough to start very near the top. Now Donald Trump did, but by and large, the Democrats are making a counter to that, and my sense is that having someone who's been through an election is probably good to have on the stump.
Especially when you have that one important debate that will come down with Mike Pence, who for better or worse, the guy can hold his own in a debate, and we'll see if he can knock that down. But lastly, on Joe Biden debating, that's becoming the running talk now, is do you see the debates coming off, and what's the format going to be for the Democrats, and how much are they going to negotiate down the liability of Joe Biden being overly distracted during these debates?
You know, I think the Democrats like where they are with this debate, you know, because it's almost, you know, may recall the that second debate of Reagan Mondale, if you're old enough to recall that Reagan had a very terrible first debate, and that the you know, the notion was, you know, can he hold his own? Can he even can he stay up there for 90 minutes without losing his train of thought? Biden may be the recipient of low expectations. You know, the more that Trump says that, he's cognitively disabled and not able to hold his own, and, you know, couldn't take the same test that I took. You know, I can't imagine that Biden won't do perfectly well by the, you know, on that standard. You know, he's been around for a long time. He's not the most fluid speaker, but he certainly knows what he thinks, what his ideas are. He's going to be extremely well prepared. And if you're looking for a Biden collapse in a debate, I think that's the standard he would like to have.
No, I don't think I'm not suggesting I'm looking for a Biden collapse, but Democrats negotiating the parameters for the debate to limit the potential downsides, meaning not having a live audience that can be distracting for Joe Biden. I mean, he has not done well in some of these interviews on television, but those haven't been largely seen by the rest of America. This will be seen by the rest of America.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that Donald Trump does all that well in this format either. And that by and large, I'm not sure right now debates are changing things.
It's fair.
You know, that, my sense is that people are pretty well, you know, if you like Donald Trump, the debate's not going to turn you off. And if you think that Trump's the worst thing in the world, you're gonna vote for Joe Biden no matter what.
Yeah, more and more I hear from business folks is that they're like, look, I just can't vote for Donald Trump again. I can't have him representing my country anymore. It's just time to move on. And they're either not going to show up and vote, or they're going to vote for Biden. And there's that dynamic playing out for a lot of folks. And these debates might be determinative for some, but as to your point, so many 90% of America voters are baked in. They're done. They are where they are.
Yeah, I think the one thing that Biden could make a vice presidential choice that people didn't like, but by and large, I don't expect him to do that. I expect him to pick somebody who has been, you can make a very credible argument for their becoming president there. And so long as he does that, I think, that's not going to hurt him. He'll have a do no harm pick on that front. And then beyond that, I don't expect the debates to really change things that dramatically. I think, the issues that could change things are issues that Trump has not done well on right now, whether it be the COVID issue or the education issue. He's just been very, struggling, and he seems to continue to go back to these old chestnuts that don't seem to adapt very well to at least what seems to be the cultural mood at the moment.
Right. There's a level of tone deafness there, but they're focused on a certain subset of the electorate, and I don't think you and I are part of that subset. So,
yeah, but I think they already have that. I think they have that subset. I mean, I don't think why do they? They can only vote once, right?
Well, one would hope. One would hope. So let's just jump real quickly to the 2021 stakes in Virginia. Who do you see coming out of the Republicans to be the Republican nominee for governor? And do you think Terry McAuliffe is going to be the choice for the Democrats?
Well, that's a great choice. Great question. Well, certainly Kirk Cox brings a new dynamic to the race, depending upon how it goes. I think he announced, largely because he wants to clear the field in some fashion of other candidates who could be supported by the Virginia business community in some ways. I think that we've seen Denver Riggleman, tossing that around. And I think so Cox comes out right after that. He's very, very, very well known to the people who traditionally have funded Virginia statewide elections. He has, he has a record. He has to be considered a very serious candidate. And the question is that in a Republican nomination contest, can he fend off, sort of a Trumpster, you might say, like Amanda Chase? I think it makes it more difficult for Bill Carrico to carve out a position here where he could win. So the challenge for Cox is, like Chris Peace and others who supported some form of Medicaid expansion, that's going to be the signature issue that Chase and others, I think, will use against him on that front. We'll have to see how he handles that. On the Democratic side, I think Terry McAuliffe would love to be able to wait until November. If you look at his Twitter feed, he keeps talking about supporting Democrats, give him money to support Democrats in 2020. Largely because then he would know what his options are. Does he have an option for a plum position in a Biden administration?
Right.
On that. And then he could decide what he wants to do. But at the moment, it looks like he's running for governor. Jennifer McClellan, Jennifer Carroll Foy, Justin Fairfax, are all running as well. McAuliffe, I think, would be the favorite in that race, but certainly he would not have a cakewalk here in that sense. So this is going to be a very interesting time, and that's, I think, the other thing that gives Republicans some hope is that the Democrats, who usually find a way to anoint a candidate pretty early on, aren't going to do it this time. And they're going to be involved in a pretty tough fight in which you're going to see some of the tensions between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the pro-business wing of the Democratic Party emerge in high relief right now. Okay, that's a great recap of the week, and going forward, we've got a lot to think about. Thank you, Dr. Bob Hollsworth, for all your insight on COVID, the Veep stakes, the special session coming up, and 2021 election cycle, which never seems to end in Virginia. There's always an election cycle to talk about. So we just call that the political pundit full employment policy, Chris. We're a lab rat for American politics, I tell you. As Rachel Bidikoff from Christopher Newport used to say, we're election nerd Disneyland, and no truer words have been spoken. Thanks again, Bob, for all your time. Hey, take care, Chris. Bye-bye.